Welcome to Voices of Australia, a podcast where we explore different perspectives on how to build a cohesive society. There are few more critical aspects at the heart of our democracy than the levels of trust we have in our institutions and the degree to which we participate in Australia's political system. Politics is not a remote game played in the distant halls of power. It shapes our daily lives, impacts our personal freedoms, and moulds our society's future. The need for meaningful political engagement and active civic participation cannot be overstated. The results of recent Mapping Social Cohesion surveys since COVID have shown a drop in public trust in political institutions. This decline is a call to action, a signal that we must all work to continue to strengthen the ties that build the public and the political world. At the centre of this work is strengthening political participation, especially in our diverse local communities. When our political representation mirrors the complexity and richness of the Australian population, it fosters a more inclusive and robust democracy. It ensures that all voices are heard and all perspectives are considered. Today, we're looking at the intersection of public trust, political engagement and inclusion. We'll examine how these elements interact, what's at stake, and how we can foster an environment where all Australians can trust in the integrity and inclusivity of our political system. To begin, we are delighted to welcome our first guest, distinguished historian Professor Frank Bongiorno AM. An expert in Australian political history, Frank has contributed extensively to our understanding of the nation's socio-political landscape through his influential book, Dreamers and Schemers, A Political History of Australia. With a storied career that spans King's College London, the University of New England, Griffith University and the Australian National University, Frank brings a depth of knowledge and a nuanced perspective on the dynamics of trust in government. He's a regular contributor to media outlets like Inside Story and The Conversation, with commentary on current debates on historical and contemporary issues. Welcome to the podcast, Frank.
Delighted to be here. Thanks, Anthea.
It's an absolute pleasure from our end. I'm thrilled that you have agreed to be a part of Voices of Australia. In your recent book, as we mentioned, Dreamers and Schemers, you explore Australia's political evolution. Could you share how the tension between the dreamers and the schemers has shaped Australia's political landscape?
Well, titles of books sometimes come quite late in the piece, and that this one's no exception. It was actually one that was dreamed up by one of my PhD students, Joshua Black. But it did, I think, reflect some of the major themes of the book. And one of those is that I think the successful practice of politics in Australia and the successful devising and implementation of policy has often required both the capacity to dream and, for want of a better word, the capacity to scheme, certainly the capacity to work the political system in a skilled way. We find, I think, those capacities sitting side by side in the most successful of our politicians. I mean, my book begins, perhaps rather oddly, for a general political history, with the memorial service for Gough Whitlam back in 2014 in the Sydney Town Hall. And I did that for a purpose, because it seems to me that Whitlam's death at that time became the occasion for a lot of reflection in the media and beyond about the possibilities for Australian politics, as well as what had gone wrong in many respects since the time of the Whitlam government. And in many ways, I think Whitlam himself embodied those two themes of dreaming and scheming. Mm-hmm. I mean, he always thought of power as having a purpose. I mean, it was never for Whitlam power for its own sake. It was certainly power. And, very famously, he told a Victorian Labor Party conference, certainly the impotent are pure, as a way of dramatising the importance of acquiring and exercising power. But it was always with a purpose. And, many of those years leading up to 1972 was spent by Whitlam in various partnerships and collaborations with thinkers, policy thinkers, sometimes located in the universities, within the bureaucracy, within various non-government organisations, as we'd call them now, about devising policy that would be worth implementing. So his idea was not merely about, having a party, a Labor Party in his case, that could be elected, but about a Labor Party that was worth electing. And so I think that idea that you do need the dreaming, you need the capacity to envisage a better order, to visualise things that aren't there at the moment, but at the same time the capacity to make that happen through the political system, I think, is very much at the heart of what I talk about in the book.
Frank, you mentioned a successful politician. What makes for a successful politician? Is it the length of time that they serve in Parliament, or electoral success, or the change they've been able to create? What makes for a successful politician?
Oh, I think running through the book, and perhaps this is more assumed than kind of argued out, is the idea that successful politicians don't merely acquire power, they use it for a particular end, a particular purpose, that they use it hopefully for a good purpose. They are not shy about the acquisition of power, but they engage in a politics that's ethical, at the same time as a politics that's designed to advance certain purposes, that there's some sort of vision of the public good or the common good underlying their politics. And, I think I show in the book that this isn't a monopoly of one or another side of politics, that we have had politicians from the different sides of politics who have nurtured an idea of the public good and have done their best to act on it. That doesn't mean that their, conduct is always exemplary. That doesn't mean that they're incapable of arousing feelings of disgust sometimes for some of the things they do. But, there's nothing, I think, emptier or more useless than a kind of politics that is really about just acquiring power for its own sake. And so I'd argue that even a figure like Billy Hughes, someone who's often maligned, I think, in Australian history and could behave quite viciously in many contexts. But I always sense with Hughes that he never really thought of power as simply there for his own pleasure. I mean, he was clearly at virtually every stage in his career always using power to try and advance a particular cause or a particular purpose that he thought was worth pursuing. And I think that's, to me, important. It's not always admirable, but it's certainly what gives politics its meaning, I think. It's certainly in a democratic culture and structure.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people are aware of the power that sits certainly at that level of federal politics. And people probably have a differing view about what's ethical or moral in relation to applying that power. But one of the things that you did mention is people having a vision. And from a social cohesion perspective, having a vision for the country is incredibly important. But not every politician is a really good communicator. Do you have, could you highlight one or two politicians that you think were really good communicators, as in brought the country along with them on that demonstration of the application of power for good?
Yeah, I mean, political communication is certainly, one of the skills that I think in a democratic system successful politicians need. And we've certainly had politicians even in recent years who are able to communicate in certain contexts, often quite well, but not in others. I mean, there was a lot of criticism of Julia Gillard, I think, on those grounds, that she was someone who clearly was a successful communicator, actually, in certain types of, contexts, perhaps more limited contexts in terms of the numbers of people involved, where, a consensus needed to be reached, where negotiations needed to be had, and where people demanded really that they were respected. And she was clearly very gifted at that. On the other hand, some of her wider public communication was often quite criticised. The term wooden was often used, I think, in that sort of situation. But we have had very skilled, very gifted communicators. The demands of communication have shifted greatly, of course, over the years, according to the different media in play. So the capacity to hold an audience in a big public meeting, for instance, was essential in the late 19th and early 20th century. A figure like Billy Hughes, who I just mentioned, had that gift. Whereas clearly in our own times, other forms of communication have been much more significant and much more important. The ability, for instance, to use television effectively. And certainly if we're thinking in terms of social cohesion, I mean, that capacity, I think, to work through the media, to address different kinds of audiences and to make people feel comfortable, yes, with the direction in which the country is going is absolutely essential. And so again, I think if we look at, recent politicians, I mean, Paul Keating was sometimes criticised, I think, for certainly having the vision, but a sense that some people felt a bit left behind, that they didn't feel as though they were included in that vision. Bob Hawke had a great gift, I think, of communication. I'm equivocal in my attitudes to Bob Hawke as a politician for a whole range of reasons, but certainly no one could, I think, criticise his capacity to kind of make people feel as though they were part of a larger whole. In fact, on the issue of social cohesion, he deserves great admiration, I think, for some of the things he did in the 1980s when there were often quite, heated debates around issues, and particularly, I think, around Asian immigration. He intervened at critical times in 1984 and then again in 1988, in many ways to reduce the heat, to assert the importance of a basically inclusive social order. Invariably, because he was a schemer as well as a dreamer, he had political advantage in mind. They always do. That's what a democratic politician does. But
he was also,
I think he did that well.
He was also seen as a man of the people, wasn't he? That effectively the language he used was the language that the vast majority of the population could understand and relate to, and wasn't over-intellectualising, where I think possibly Paul Keating possibly falls into that sort of category of the intellectual. But are there other recurring themes that you see within Australia's political evolution? There's particularly anything that you think does say something about the degree of our trust in institutions?
Yeah, and so one of the things I found in the book, and it's surprising, I've been studying this for decades now, and it wasn't really until writing this book that I was quite able to get my head around this. I mean, Australia's political system, or systems, if you like, in some ways we've had multiple systems over the millennia that the book discusses. But certainly, if we think about the post-British invasion systems that we've had, they've generally been designed to serve the interests of often a restricted group, and primarily we'd say, kind of white men, perhaps even white Anglo or Anglo-Celtic men. And yet what I found in the book, and particularly I think in the era of self-government that followed the 1850s, is that this was a system that also provided openings for others. They weren't able to participate on equal terms to the dominant group, but they were able to find spaces for participation. The question I was always asking in this book is, what did people demand of the political system? How did they go about getting it? And how successful was the political system in responding to their, needs and demands? Essentially the three big questions, or maybe one question with three parts that I always had in mind. And look, I found that right from, certainly the 1860s onwards, that marginalised groups that this system wasn't really designed to serve were able to use it. And examples of that, I think, of Indigenous people in Victoria, for instance, First Nations people in Victoria in the 1860s and 1870s, calling for the grant of land at Corranderk near Healesville, and then using the political system in order to keep it, in the face of efforts by settlers to take it from them. And they managed to do that for a couple of decades. And I think that is kind of an illustration of what I have in mind. The participation of Chinese people in the political system. Again, we think of the White Australia policy. We think of a political system in the 19th century, the 1800s, really devised to marginalise and exclude Asian people. And yet, the Chinese people, mainly Chinese men who found themselves in Australia from the gold rushes onwards, were able to find those little spaces, those little cracks and openings, if you like, to try and make the political system work for them. They used petitioning, they formed delegations, they occasionally engaged in pamphleteering, they participated in both municipal and parliamentary electoral politics. So I'm not suggesting they were able to do so on equal terms, of course, but I think I find this pattern in the system more generally, that it's generally provided those openings for those forms of participation. And it was something that I think I'd underestimated when I set out on the task of writing the book.
Do you think we are moving to a greater understanding of the intercultural nature of Australian population and how that really does need to play out in our democracy and our politics?
Oh, I think so. The 2022 election was interesting in that respect. I mean, clearly there has been a persistent underrepresentation of many ethnic groups within our political system. And I think particularly at the federal or national level, the parliament has not been really a reflection of the diversity of the country. And, the paradox there is that you could argue that in many ways Australia has been quite successful, I think, in its multicultural policy and in essentially marking out a kind of middle ground that conservative populism hasn't really been able to successfully challenge in Australia. So if we look at, the era in which we've lived over the last decade, the era of Trump, the era of Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, of, conservative and often racist populisms in a number of countries around the world, it seems to me that in Australia, broadly speaking, the middle ground, that if you like, a basic support for multiculturalism, a basic recognition of the value of immigration, socially, culturally, economically, has largely held up. And it's worth thinking about, what other countries, developed countries, do we find around the world of which we could say the same thing. And I follow here the late Stuart McIntyre in identifying two, and I think they're probably New Zealand and Canada are two others where I think that middle ground has largely held. And it's interesting to speculate about how and why. I mean, all three of those countries, we could see as kind of settler colonial nations that often had a very strong sense of the importance of racial purity and of whiteness once upon a time. But, from, I suppose, about the 1960s onwards, adopted different ways of thinking about their composition and their society and social relations generally. Multiculturalism, is usually attributed to Canada, isn't it, in its origins and applied elsewhere. New Zealand, of course, has had a policy of biculturalism over a long period. And so it seems to me that there are three interesting cases that we probably should do a lot more comparison actually between them, because, whilst one doesn't want to be too celebratory, I think it is notable that, when those, I think often, very aggressive forms of populism were gathering momentum, I suppose you could say from about the middle of the last decade, they had some impact in Australia without question. But not as much impact as many people feared they would. And I think that is a mark of the kind of politics. Perhaps it goes back to the point I was making earlier about those openings that our politics has often left for dissenting voices.
Yeah. Many people would refer to our mandatory voting system as one of the things that sort of underpins some of that democratic resilience. I'm wondering what advice you would give to countries that are just embarking on democracy. Is mandatory voting one of those things that you think we should encourage in other countries?
We can, but we probably won't have much success because I think it's so rooted in Australian political culture and experience. It was only adopted federally in 1924 and in the various states around that time or soon afterwards. But, as I think Judith Brett has shown in a book on this topic, it's very rooted in a very what she calls a utilitarian attitude to our politics. That is, this notion of the greatest good for the greatest number. The fact that we don't worry terribly much in Australia over abstract rights. We tend to see rights as essentially being constructed through the law and through the process of actually practicing politics. So, we do have obviously a rights discourse in Australia, but it's certainly weaker than in the United States, where, you have a Bill of Rights where the whole issue of abstract rights is much more prominent within the political culture. Something like compulsory voting would be unthinkable in the United States, and I think that, or virtually unthinkable, and I think that speaks to a very different kind of political culture. So we can certainly advocate it. It clearly has all sorts of benefits, in terms of perhaps preserving that middle ground I was talking about earlier. But at the same time, I think it's very rooted in our own particular historical experience, and we perhaps need to recognise that it mightn't be exportable in the way that perhaps some other aspects of our culture might be.
Yeah, that's very true. It is interesting that we've got so many people who have come to live in Australia and make Australia their home, but they come from very different political systems. And so whether or not they feel that compulsory voting is something that they think is more a burden than a right is sort of interesting to look at its history. And as you say, this has only been the case since 1924. So how do you think we should communicate the value of that compulsory voting component and the I guess evolution of our politics to people who are newly arrived into Australia?
Well, it's a really good question, Anthony, because I think that the way in which we conduct elections in Australia, and compulsory voting is only really a part of a much broader situation, really. I mean, we've had highly bureaucratic forms of election for a very, very long time in Australia, going right back to the 1850s. I remember doing some work many years ago on New England, the area of northern New South Wales, northwestern New South Wales, and looking at some early elections there. And I was astonished at a description of a polling booth that had two queues, A to K, I think, and L to Z. And I just thought, what an extraordinary thing. I mean, this is a time when elections could still be turbulent even in Australia. There could be violence on election day. Violence still occurred in Britain on election day, and yet that bureaucratic impulse, that impulse towards establishing order was there, from the 1850s and 1860s. And I think that we need to make more of it. That said, I think we do make much more of it than we used to. I think it's become much more integral to the ways in which we differentiate ourselves from other countries, and notably now, of course, the United States. The United States did not have an orderly transfer of power, and they often boast about their capacity to do that, of course, but it didn't happen in 2020, 2021, whereas the transfer of power in Australia, with one exception, I think, and that would be November, December 1975, has generally been of an orderly, and even in 1975 was mainly non-violent. I mean, there was some low-level violence, but generally not a high level of violence, certainly nothing like what we saw in the United States recently. And I think that has become much more central to how we think about ourselves and our place in the world, and how we explain to the world that we're not the United States, or we're not the 51st state, that old phrase that people used to use for Australia, or we're not Austerica, we're something different. And we point to other things as well. We point to our gun laws. We point to healthcare provision in Australia, a whole range of things that differentiate ourselves from the United States. But I think free and fair elections and our capacity to run them in a very orderly way, the whole democracy sausage image, of course, that rather cutesy image, perhaps too cutesy, that has come to attach to election day, is a part of that scenario, I think.
It is interesting to think about the different generations in society as well, not just the new arrivals, but young people tend to be slightly more disconnected from a national view of being Australian, and tend to see themselves far more as global citizens, but also the sense of their ability to achieve their aspirations tends to be declining somewhat. Do you think there is a need then to continue to build that awareness of how where Australia has got to and the real positives that exist in our politics to be able to actually have a voice and to make change?
Yeah, and I think it's a paradox, isn't it, that concept of the fair go has been, you could almost call it a national slogan, really. I mean, it's the one that sort of sits there virtually all the time as a way of framing a political discourse, policy discussion. What is a fair go? And, that's a powerful sort of impulse, I think, in Australian policy and political history. And yet we are, I think, as a society, very tolerant of significant and sometimes growing levels of inequality. Obviously, the inequalities between Indigenous and settler Australians, the alarming incarceration rates among Indigenous Australians speak to a fundamental inequality. I believe, is it about 32% of those currently incarcerated are Indigenous? The generational issue that you raise, I think, is a powerful one. So many areas of our policy around taxation, around housing, for instance, around income and wages, really institutionalise significant inequalities between the generations, make it difficult for younger people to break into the housing market, that sort of great Australian dream of home ownership that has been there for so long. So we have a kind of a language, if you like, of the fair go, and I think it undoubtedly shapes, it has an impact on the way in which we do policy and do politics in Australia. And yet we've often, I think, been very tolerant of quite significant degrees of actual inequality. It's almost that distinction, I think, between a kind of social egalitarianism, which I think is quite deeply ingrained, at the same time as economic inequality being something we're prepared to tolerate. I mean, we see it also, I think, in the very different educational opportunities, across the public and private systems of schools. So that's one of the great paradoxes, I think, of our politics in Australia, and it's one that I think anyone concerned with social cohesion, needs to grapple with. It obviously does have ethnic dimensions, but as you say, it's also about the differences between young and old, and those old-fashioned, those old language, old concepts that we perhaps don't hear enough about. Simply class inequality, which remains, very much a part of Australian life.
Has fairness been a narrative throughout our politics?
Yes, I think it has been a narrative through our politics. The idea, the term fair go isn't the one that's always used, but the idea that Australia was kind of the land of the second chance, I think, has been very powerful. I think that's embedded probably in convict origins. It was applied very unequally, of course, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and continues to be, but certainly if we're thinking of the sort of European or British settlement or invasion of Australia and the kinds of culture that was established here from the 1780s onwards, it was often about this idea that Australia was a place where you could ultimately have a second chance, that there was a chance for fairness. And when one thinks of the policies around things like land selection, the movement for land reform in the 1860s, 70s and 80s, it was very much about giving opportunities to those who'd been locked out of control of the land by earlier waves of pastoralists running their sheep across it. And we, come right through to things like the living wage concept, which really took off in Australia from the 1890s and was instituted in the Harvester Judgment of 1907 by Henry Bourne Higgins, the president of the arbitration court of the day, and that concept that it shouldn't be the market that drove wages, that wage setting needed to take account of the needs of the worker and the needs of the worker's family. And so I think that concept of fairness has certainly underpinned a lot of these kinds of policy interventions, and we can no doubt trace it through to more recent innovations such as the National Disability Insurance insurance scheme, which I think is also underpinned by some of these kinds of ideas.
I think what you're highlighting is how incredibly valuable it is to have a book like yours that stretches across time. It is incredibly easy, I think, to just focus in on the now and completely forget the history that's got us here. And I think, as you point out, many of us don't even think about the politics that existed within First Nations peoples. That really is so important to the foundation of the book that you've written here, and in really highlighting that there are different forms of governance that have been playing out in different ways. But over that time, the media has also changed. Do you have a view as to whether or not you think the media is responding to the community or the community is responding to the media in our views about politics?
Yes, I think media concentration in Australia is one of the frailties of its democracy, and it undoubtedly affects issues around diversity and cohesion. I mean, if our media is dominated by narrow interests, if our journalists perhaps aren't coming from, it's not just our parliaments that need to reflect our cultural diversity, it's also our media and our journalists that need to. So, where that doesn't occur, I think you are, likely to have certain voices excluded or marginalised. Media has always been integral to politics in Australia, and when I say that, I mean really, you could argue going right back into pre-contact Indigenous society, if you want a very broad understanding of what media involves. But certainly if we're thinking about the period since 1788, the forms of media, whether we're talking newspapers, which we've had in Australia since 1803, television, radio, the social media, they don't simply reflect our politics. They're not simply the means by which politics are undertaken. They're integral to the political system. Newspaper editors and proprietors have often played a direct role in basically the formation of governments. David Syme in Melbourne, the legendary editor of the Melbourne Age newspaper, was a deeply influential figure. One thinks of Keith Murdoch in the 1930s playing a major role in the elevation of Joseph Lyons as Prime Minister and the Lyons government, which was in power right through the 30s in Australia. And we also have accounts from historians such as Sally Young of the ways in which particularly newspaper ownership was leveraged in order to control other parts of the media. So, newspaper owners often grabbed a large share of ownership of radio and particularly of television when that came along. And of course, those big media companies still remain really major players in social media as well. So, this is a part of the paradox I was talking about earlier, really, of our belief again in kind of the dispersal of power and wealth. And yet we've been very tolerant, I think, of high levels of media concentration by a limited number of families in many instances who've been able to exercise power for many, many decades. I mean, one exception to that was the Herald and Weekly Times, which wasn't a family-based dynasty, but of course, eventually that company went to Rupert Murdoch. So, the role of particular powerful families has been very important in that world as well. Yeah, but now we have social media, which tends to be bringing all sorts of different narratives from overseas into Australia as well, and causes buffeting, if you like, to people's views about the world that aren't necessarily completely relevant to the way politics is playing out. It is going to be interesting to see whether or not that does influence our politics into the future. Do you have a view about, the speed at which changes may occur in our politics into the future? Yeah, there's a sense of acceleration, and perhaps social media is a part of that, this notion of the kind of 24-hour news cycle, which is obviously very different to the days of print newspapers. And I mean, a question you asked earlier, Anthony, which I didn't probably answer very fully, was around the identities of younger people, which, as you say, are often perhaps more cosmopolitan or global rather than national. And obviously social media is very much a part of that story, isn't it? When I think of my own 17-year-old daughter who, a lot of her world revolves around screen time and TikTok and content that is fundamentally, well, we call it global, but it's often Anglosphere and very often American, of course.
Yes.
And so another way in which American cultural influence remains very important. In terms of the impacts on our politics, well, you know, the 2022 election was such an interesting occasion, wasn't it, for what it revealed, I guess,
Absolutely.
about the declining capacity, I suppose, of the traditional political parties to corral votes. The primary vote for the lower house, the House of Representatives, where governments are formed, sort of divided three ways. And I suppose that's a part of a larger story that obviously Scanlon's been very interested in over the years, and that's, as you mentioned earlier, political trust. And one of the, I suppose, manifestations of that decline in political trust that we've seen, with obviously some exceptions. I mean, there were interesting survey results during COVID, weren't there, which showed increases in trust. But leaving that aside, you know, there obviously has been a broad decline. And one of its manifestations is, I suppose, a declining trust or faith in the ability of political parties to affect progressive change or to do the kinds of things that they, you know, were once set to do, you know. So that's been interesting. The independent phenomenon, obviously the rise of the Greens, which is very closely connected, I think, to younger people's politics. I think the Greens, I mean, they have supporters across different age groups, but I think for many younger voters have been a very important aspect of political identity. I mean, voting is to a large extent expressive. You know, it's not just about policy preference. Who we vote for is an expression of how we see ourselves and who we are. And I think for many young people, voting for the Greens has been a part of that. The community independents, I think, have also tapped into some of those sensibilities around key constituencies. Women voters, for instance, who've often seen themselves poorly reflected in the major political parties. So these shifts are important. We don't really know at this stage, you know, whether 2022, you know, kind of is a blueprint for what, you know, the future is going to look like, or whether it was more an immediate response to a particular disillusionment with the Morrison government and with his leadership. We have to wait for that, I think. But, you know, certainly the decline in political trust as measured by the surveys has been striking over the last, you know, 15 or 20 years. Yeah.
Frank, can I just ask you one question, which does relate to the point that you made about COVID, because we noticed that trust in government just shot up during COVID. And it was because of this sense of the government actually does care about us, and it is underpinning our own economic benefit. And in actual fact, it's going across all of society to make sure that we're all safe and secure. Now all of those things have gone, and we've seen that trust in government drop, not as far back as it was pre the pandemic, but it has dropped considerably. Do you think that reaction, that sense of, well, the government can do it if it's actually needed, will have an effect on people's views about what's possible in the future, that don't tell us you can't do it because we've just seen you do it?
Yeah, I think that's we've seen that in some of the political discourse around job seeker, haven't we? Around the unemployment benefit. If the Morrison government could basically double it during COVID and drag thousands of people out of poverty, why can't it be done more generally? And I think that's been a source of welcome, from my point of view anyway, welcome pressure on the present government. They probably don't welcome it, but it's been a source of pressure because, you know, Labor obviously identifies itself as for social justice. And, you know, that's one area where Australia is well behind many other developed countries in you know, the support that it provides to unemployed people. I mean, the other area where I think there is a bit of a, shall I call it a revolution, certainly a transformation occurring at the moment, is really a growing scepticism about the kind of contracting out of government services. And I think COVID exposed some of the major problems around that, particularly in aged care was obviously the area where it looked particularly bad. But, you know, even in relation to temporary measures like hotel quarantine, that idea that you know, government could kind of contract things out to private industry and all will be well and they'll do it better than government. I think there's a real a growing scepticism about that, which, I think will affect attitudes and hopefully policy in areas like childcare, aged care, employment services, a whole range of areas where, that process of contracting out has been underway certainly since the 1980s and really took off in the 1990s. Yeah.
This has been a fabulous conversation, Frank, and I just have one last question, which is, through the process of writing this book, was there anything that you didn't know that you saw that just made you laugh out loud?
Yeah. I did laugh out loud from time to time. I mean, one thing I've quoted in the book is, on the fall of the Bruce Page government in 1929, you might think that's a bit arcane, and it is, I suppose. It's usually attributed to the position it took over industrial relations. It tried to dismantle the old arbitration system and is usually seen as having been punished for that by being brought down to the floor of the House and then kicked out at the next election. What I found is that there was another issue at play, and that was the hostility of the cinema industry to a new tax that the government was introducing at the time. And I found this extraordinary account of a lobbyist in Canberra. It was the very early days of Canberra as the capital, basically getting politicians drunk and essentially carrying them in and out of the House at various times so they could vote, basically to assist the cinema industry. So it gave me another perspective on why that government had fallen, and I could see that it wasn't entirely about industrial relations, that there were other things at play. At one point in the book, I described, Canberra in that period for the politicians, exclusively male politicians at that stage, as being a bit like a camp, a sort of a boys' camp. And that particular letter for me really brought that idea home. So I did laugh out loud at that.
Oh, that's just wonderful. And I've got to say, there's just a wealth of stories in there to read, and I would encourage anybody to read Dreamers and Schemers. It is an extraordinary publication and certainly an important education for everybody that's living in Australia. So, Frank, thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I thank you enormously for adding to our Voices of Australia conversation.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a privilege to talk with you. Thanks, Anthea. Cheers.
Thanks, Frank. Our second guest is Dai Trang Lee, MP, a changemaker, independent federal member for Fowler, and a champion for diversity and inclusion. With an extensive local government background, including a stint as the Deputy Mayor of Fairfield City, Lee's advocacy is rooted in fostering inclusivity and representation. She's a staunch advocate for diverse political engagement, leveraging her unique experiences to champion the voices of her constituents. A former award-winning journalist and the founder of Dawn, a boutique agency advocating for cultural diversity and leadership, Dai has been an unwavering, dedicated person to creating a truly inclusive society. Welcome to our podcast, Dai.
Thank you. Such a warm introduction there. Very
well, it probably doesn't necessarily do you justice, but it's delightful to have you here. So thank you so very much. If you don't mind, and it would be great to just talk about your transition from Vietnam to Australia and that very difficult 4-year journey that you undertook. How have the challenges that you confronted there influenced your decision to enter the world of politics?
I don't know, obviously your audience, if they're familiar with the journey of a refugee, and the Vietnamese refugee exodus is probably one of the earliest exodus of refugees from war-torn countries, conflict zones. Obviously, when you have to flee your country, and I was a young girl when that happened, you weren't actually aware of what was going on. I was 7 years old. And because of our relationship, or the Vietnamese relationship, South Vietnamese relationship with the Americans, and my family, part of my family were working with the Americans, that meant for us that was a threat in terms of our us being associated with the United States of America. So my mother fled, and my father, I think, stayed behind and then subsequently was disappeared during the war. But my mum, she took us girls and escaped. And so that was a very challenging, when you just don't know what was going to happen to you. I didn't sort of know what was going on, but Mum took that risk, and then we ended up got to the Philippines with thousands of other Vietnamese refugees, and then stayed there. And then my mother took on a second journey 3 years later. So in my life, in my young life, in the first 10 years of my life, I've had 2 boat journeys, 2 refugee camps experiences, which meant that we did not have a proper education. We were, surrounded constantly by strangers and people that we don't know. And all of that really, I think, exposed me to the uncertainties of life. And how do you deal with uncertainties and those changes, and how do you adapt quickly? And I think the refugee journey for me enabled me, once we got accepted to be resettled in Australia through being processed by the United Nations, the UNHCR. We were processed in Hong Kong, where our second stop was, and we got here. That means the transition to Australia was no difference to, say, leaving Vietnam and being on the boat, escaping and being in camp. So to me, it was another of those situations whereby I had to adapt very quickly, and we adapted very quickly. Did not know that we were going to be here, and Australia became our home, our second homeland, with what was a temporary settlement until we go back to Vietnam. But obviously that wasn't the case. And looking back, I think that we're very grateful that Australia accepted us. We came under then the Liberal government, I think Malcolm Fraser, who opened the doors to Vietnamese refugees, and rebuild our lives.
And you went to a migrant hostel when you arrived here, didn't you? What was that experience like? Because the way you've mentioned some of the things that I think there are an awful lot of people who haven't been through the same sort of journey that you have, that aren't familiar with just the whole idea of simply meeting strangers all the time. The way you just articulated that is something that is really quite foreign. And even though we meet strangers, we don't necessarily think of them in the same way as this is a completely foreign group of people that I have no idea what their intention is. I've got no idea of what their, how do I get the cues from body language to really understand whether I'm in a trusting relationship or a situation or not. So, what was your experience like through that migrant hostel situation, and has that had an effect on your views about thinking about new arrivals into Australia now?
Yeah, so I think a lot of arrivals of refugees arriving in Australia in the last decade, for instance, say from Syria, a lot of them were reunited with their families. So they come here and they are living with their families, even though, especially here in the city of Fowler, we had 10,000 out of the 12,000 refugees who were resettled in Australia from the Syrian conflict. So they were connected with their families, and they live in 3-bedroom households, so it is overcrowded and all that. For us, that wasn't the experience. We had no one. We had no relatives here. So when we got here, we were resettled in a migrant hostel in Ferrymeadow, and again, it's a 1-bedroom place, a hostel. It used to be an army, I think, a mess where that was used for the Australian military or defence. And so you were surrounded by people, again, you've never met, but there were people who had escaped Romania, I think at the time from Hungary. So there were those refugees, quite a few Vietnamese refugees, but from different camps. That arrived. So you got to connect with some of these Vietnamese who spoke the same language as you, because none of us could speak English at the time. So it was comforting to have families who spoke the same language as you, even though you don't know them, and we connected with these families, and even some of those Romanian families, even though English wasn't the way that we can communicate with them, but it's through, lining up at the mess to get our food, breakfast, lunch, and dinner that we kind of, through sign languages, we connected. So I think you just adapted. I adapted very quickly. The kids, myself being the eldest, my two younger sisters, adapted. We, at the time, had the St. Vincent's St. Vincent de Paul Lady Society, who came to help a lot of the refugees by bringing us clothes, by introducing us to the local school. So I went to the local Catholic primary school, and they helped Mum find, my mum found a job cleaning houses as a domestic cleaner because she couldn't talk very well. Yeah. And so we, for me, in my mind, the first thing that I decided when I got here I was about 10, was that I said, look, in my head, I said, I have to learn English, because otherwise how else am I going to survive this if I don't learn English quickly? And so going to school, I focused very quickly to learn the language. And that obviously helped my mother as well, because a lot of the kids, my mum being a single mum, meant that she relied a lot on us kids to help her navigate.
Absolutely. You've clearly built on that in the most astonishing fashion, because you've been an incredibly successful journalist, both in written media but also at the ABC. What was it about those experiences, or your entire life up until the time that you decided to join politics, that actually made politics attractive to you? What was it that you were hoping to get from having a political position?
Believe it or not, I actually never aspired to get into politics. And if you ask any of the children of refugees, politics isn't something that they aspire to get into, because it was because of politics that we lost our homeland, and therefore our parents would really discourage us from doing anything. They would encourage us to become a lawyer, a doctor. Majority of children of Vietnamese background and refugee background, they are lawyers, or predominantly doctors and then accountants. So I actually was lost. So I did not know what to do once I finished year 12. I, spent about a year trying to figure out my life, and I ended up landing a job as a cadet journalist out here in Liverpool in the seat of Fowler. And I loved that I discovered that path, because suddenly I discovered that I was able to search for stories similar to mine, and then were able to share those stories with the wide Australian public, because at the time, in the 70s when we first arrived, we had just come out of the White Australia policy, which I discovered during my time as a journalist, to discover those era. I did not know what it meant at the time, because growing up in Fairy Meadow, I felt that we were very welcomed by the community. I hardly experienced any kind of racism. There were kids at school, they'll call you ching chong or slanty eyes, but I did not make it to mean anything other than those kids were just, didn't like the shape of my eyes or whatever, but I did not put it down to being discriminated against, but it's very minimal. And so for me, that being able to be a journalist and telling stories was something I thought, oh my God, I can actually go and tell stories of what I've been through and I've been through. And that means the Australian public here in the Liverpool area, at the time it was not as multicultural as it is today, about our stories and our journeys and others, and share experiences. So that was I want to do more of, is to tell more of those diverse stories in our community.
Yeah. How has your relationship with the community evolved over time? And can you talk perhaps to the importance of trust in having the type of role that you do at the federal level?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I grew up here. Of course, I moved out for a short time being, but my family came from here, from Fowler, which has become more one of the most multicultural electorates in the country. I would attest to and will claim. And I think the trust came from that. People have seen me around since I was in my 20s. I've grown old. Some of them, I've known them for the last 20, 30 years. Being a journalist, having that cultural background also helped with people from similar background to myself, either being a refugee or migrant, not necessarily cultural, but having that experience, lived experience, that background, enable those people to trust me, in that they trust that I know what I'm talking about, and I know I can relate to them, and I genuinely can relate to them, and that I'm not just making it up because I have not been through that path. So I think the trust came from the fact that they know my story, and therefore they know that I can relate to their own personal stories, be they come from Italian background or Spanish, or now the Middle East, like from Iraq and Assyrian and Chaldean. Those who've got the refugee sort of background know that I know what they've been through. They are going through, because I have been through that. Yeah.
So I'm interested in knowing whether or not that trust that is built into that relationship, that longevity that you've had in Fowler, does that play a part in what issues people bring to the fore? I mean, what sort of things do people within Fowler talk about? What are the things that they're most concerned about?
So absolutely, knowing like that I have had since my elections, it's about a year now, I've got people coming in here into the office who said they've never, approached an MP's office before, because they didn't think that person would understand what they've been through. They use this office a lot. So we have a lot, I think we have more constituents coming to see me because I can relate to them. Mm-hmm. That's what they tell me. They come to me with issues of, from the smallest things like a fine. They would explain to me, this morning I had an elderly couple from Assyrians who arrived here as refugees and got processed, but then their daughter and son-in-law are still stuck in Iraq. But the daughter just passed away, and they've got 3 grandchildren there, and they want to bring them over.
Oh my.
And I'm saying to them, I said, oh my God, I said, our Australian immigration system will not allow that, mm-hmm. Especially if you have 2 elderly grandparents. And they cry, and they said, but what it's like, when you don't have your loved ones. I said, absolutely, I said, my grandmother's still back in Vietnam, but I said, look, I'll write a representation letter. I said, I can't guarantee that this government or any government will be compassionate about that, because obviously these are 2 elderly people, and if they were to sponsor their grandchildren over, they would not be able to care for them. And so I think our immigration system and the way that we let people into the country is done in a way that I understand that we need to be mindful of Australian citizens like me, or those who live here, and how much of the responsibility we have to play. But I also understand that the resources that would need to bring those 3 kids over here, and who is going to be paying for that, it will be the taxpayers. So I'm aware of all of that. But, immigration people come here a lot, and they don't treat this. People have gone to other MPs' office, and they find that those MPs have not engaged with them. But they come here and they say, because I have been a refugee, mm-hmm. so I know. Right, so they use and I said, yes, I know. So that's the difference, is that they come here because they say that I know what. Well,
it's that acknowledgement, isn't it, that their pathway is very particular, and it needs to be viewed through understanding eyes.
That's right.
One of the things that you clearly do, because that's just what you described, is help to bridge the knowledge between individuals and the government and the way government operates. From a democratic perspective, and thinking about the fact that there is a referendum coming up, do you have, can you sort of explain, I guess, something about what the diversity of views are about what democracy is or looks like, and how we need to perhaps help the education process of understanding all of these different dynamics, from the very least thing about, what does immigration actually allow or not allow, as well as the broader understanding of your rights and responsibilities in this space?
Oh, look, I mean, first of all, they can't distinguish between local, state, or federal.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to educate them. So I'm in my office, for instance, and I found that there seemed to be no appetite by our political system and processes to educate a community like Fowler about the different levels of government.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important. So people are like, you asked me for people coming here to me about car parking fines. They come in here to me about housing. They come to me about visa. So they come to me to ask help for a whole range of issues that's related to local, state, and federal.
Mm-hmm.
But when you say to them, oh, that's a federal issue, they've got no understanding. What does that mean? Aren't you just a member of parliament? So they don't distinguish that. So my office is trying to, putting together material to explain the different levels of government. That's first of all in terms of our democratic processes. Second, they think that the young people are understanding that, but it's that the older generation are not. But even for the younger people, they're thinking, everybody goes to vote every 4 years. But I said, no, federally, you actually only vote every 3 years. I said, oh, really? Oh, how come? I said, well, that's just the system. So those simple things, if people don't understand, then other complex things such as immigration, it'll be harder for them to understand and comprehend. So the most important thing for me as an elected member is to, while comforting them, try and being as honest as I can with them, and not raise hopes for them that, I'll write a letter for you and let's see, but actually put in some kind of framework for them to think, I will give my best shot to write, but I just want you to know that this is not a guarantee that's going to happen because our system will not allow that to happen. Mm-hmm. A lot of the times, actually, I say that, whether or not that's a harsh thing for me to do, but I just don't want to say to people, yeah, I'll write it for you and we'll work and make sure that it happens, because that's prolonging a person's hope that they'll be able to bring their...
Transparency is one of those things that's particularly important to building trust. So I think that's a very wise approach. As you know, the Scallon Foundation Research Institute is all about social cohesion. So I was wondering whether or not you could describe what you think social cohesion means to you, or certainly within the context of Fowler. Do you feel that that's a cohesive society? What are the things that you think underpin that social cohesion?
Absolutely. I'm aware of, I love the Scallon Institute sort of research and paper around social cohesion. And I think that we've got, for me, Fowler is one of the most cohesive electorates in the country, because we have over 150 different languages spoken, and people from those 150 different cultural backgrounds, and yet they live side by side, both religious-wise as well as cultural as well. And I think that the secret to cohesion is the leadership of those communities, who will not use the differences to peddle some kind of popular popular topic, and so, but you ensure that whatever conversation that you do, you have to take into consideration the diversity of Fowler. We have Turkish, Assyrian living side by side here, and I don't know if you're aware of the whole tension around genocide and the whole Turkish, Turkey and people from the Middle East and those who are Armenian and Assyrian. This whole cult religious tension there. And sometimes when I go to these community groups, I have to be so mindful of that, and they are actually also mindful of me, which is, I'm very grateful for that. That I might be taking one side over another, but listening to both sides. We'll have also the Vietnamese. I'm trying to really create some sort of reconciliation bridge between the Vietnamese here in Fowler, who are like my family, escaped communist Vietnam, they do not see Vietnam as a progressive country. They only can remember Vietnam, what it was like in 75 when they left. But children, like people like myself and their children, have gone back and have seen how Vietnam has transformed itself. So I have to also navigate that in terms of, the Vietnamese here and the Vietnamese students coming over who are from the current Vietnamese government. How do you ensure that there is cohesiveness and living side by side in harmony? So I straddle these issues on a daily basis, and therefore there are no one protesting, no one going out there and condemning one group over another, even though they know they're living side by side. So I think for me that it's successful in that they respect the differences and they'll use their significant cultural days to raise issues, but then they move on and live like any ordinary Australians would.
Absolutely. Just a couple of more questions, Di, because I know you have to go in time to, as any politician, you've got 1,000 meetings in any one day. This area of leadership that you talked about and leadership across the community, one of these important roles that you play is helping to set a vision, if you like, to which those leaders can also play a part in, a sense of what you think Fowler should look like, how you think Fowler is going to progress over time, and how do you then engage with those other leaders to bring them along so that you're all building that same sort of sense of optimism for the future. Is that something that you see playing out within Fowler in this particular point in time?
Absolutely. I have been very proactive in, for instance, for the last 12 months since my election, I have really engaged with my community around many issues such as housing, childcare, small business, so that they inform me the importance of that. I mean, I had a creative arts group that come in here. They said, no MP has ever reached out to us to have a conversation around what are the issues that are impacting us as creatives here in Fowler. The same with the childcare industry. For the local MP, no one has really got together and say, how can we work together? How can my role as a federal MP provide some kind of facilitate and bring people together to create solutions for our community locally, rather than waiting for the big government to fix the problem, because big government or government will never fix anyone's problem. So I see my role as not just as a member of parliament, as somebody who actually can utilise where I am to bring stakeholders together, community members together, those who are impacted together, say, okay, let's find a solution. This morning I had a meeting around housing because while we're waiting for the policy piece to pass in the Senate, that means the 30,000 social housing that the government promised is not going to be delivered, and it's even if it gets passed, it's not going to happen in the next 12 to 18 months unless you really take action in bringing those who can make it happen, such as local government, state government, developers, and bodies such as NIFIC and all of that to come together and say, how viable is it that if we work together, we can at least get one set of housing built between now and 18 months. And that's what I think as a member of parliament, your position or a position as a member of parliament, you can actually facilitate that and make that happen rather than going into and vote and wait for a piece of policy. Because realistically, there are people in the community that can make it happen.
Yes, yeah. It's so important that that one of the real strengths of being a federal MP is that you can articulate what those issues are and recognise the connectivity. Now, on a totally different, and this is my final question, on a totally different point, I know that food is something that's very important to you in understanding how the role that food can play in regard to social cohesion, because you've done something for us previously in that space. Yeah. Do you want to just mention something about how important is food in the way that you interact with constituents?
Oh, look, food I think is so critical in connecting people, and I'm so blessed that I am in one of the most diverse electorates with diverse cuisines ever. Anywhere, you won't find it anywhere, and it breaks so many so many barriers in terms of connection. I can sit across and have some fatouche dish. With people from the Middle East, Iraq, Assyrian, Chaldean. I can eat a fatouche salad, which I'm sure you have too. Easy to digest. To some of the more elaborate meals and a lot of the functions, the elaborate meals, you kind of talk over the food. The same with Vietnamese, Cambodian. Food brings people together.
Yeah, it certainly does.
And I think that we have it here. Even a sausage sizzle.
Very true.
You can bring people over and they have a sausage sizzle to fundraise and all that stuff. So I can't emphasize the importance of it. And in my family, we love food. We cook. We the last 3 weeks we've just been using food as a comfort to remind me of my mum. So
Yeah, no, an incredibly important point to make, and thank you so much for being so open and sharing not only your journey but also your thoughts about where the world should go in the future and the importance of food. And next time I talk to you, we'll talk about karaoke. So.
Oh yeah, yes, please. It's another connector.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Daili. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Hi, Matt. It's great to have you here with us again for this little end of podcast chat.
No, thank you for having me again.
Not at all. It's an absolute pleasure. And just for those that might not have heard the other ones, you're an early PhD student at Monash University.
Yep.
But also you're relatively newly arrived into Australia. So this is one of the first introductions to having conversations about our politics. So was there anything that stood out to you in our two conversations with Daili or Frank Bongiorno?
For sure. I mean, what I really loved actually was the kind of contrast that we had between the guests today. So Frank gave us such an amazing, interesting, in-depth background and framework for how politics works here. And then Daili gives that really personal kind of driving focus.
Absolutely.
I think it gives that more of a rounded view of politics. A lot of things stood out. And I think, again, only being here for a few months, one of the things that stood out, maybe it's me just being in somewhat optimistic surroundings, but I've heard time and time again about the Australian fair go, about how everybody should get a chance. And, coming from a diverse background myself, well, a relatively diverse background myself, it's a really refreshing thing to hear. And I think even if Australian politics doesn't always live up to that ideal, that standard, the fact that it is one of the driving forces between political and social life I think it's a really great thing.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that when you have a constituency from a federal level of 25 million people, every single one has a different view about exactly what fairness means to them. But it is interesting to see some of this ebb and flow over time that Frank talked about, where you can actually see that narrative playing out regardless of what the different ideologies are that might be in government at any one time.
Yeah, I think he did make a really important point as well, that the system was set up for a specific purpose and a specific group of people. But even within that, there is still room for other voices to be heard. And I think particularly the interview with Dai showed that system is still in the process of opening up, and there is space for it to be opened up. It's not kind of locked in for just this small group of people. There is space for others to come in and widen that scope, which I think is a great thing.
Absolutely. It is also, we have a representative democracy, and it is really important that we have representatives that are of community, that actually can relate to the different aspects that different parts of the community actually bring, and can then convey that into the decisions that are being made at a federal level.
Yeah, I think Dai made a really great point where a a lot of the trust that she gets is from that lived experience that she has, and people can see that lived experience. Certainly in other countries, I haven't been in Australia long enough to really determine, in other countries there's this feeling kind of disconnect from your politicians because they are in a different plane, they have different background to you, they usually come from kind of elite backgrounds. Seeing Di being who she is, the experiences that she's talked about and she's gone through, and being able to relate to the people that she serves, I think that's one of the most important things you can have in a politician.
It is, isn't it? And I do think that the great thing about this podcast has been that we've covered a whole variety of different topics and bringing different voices to how we might interpret those things. Politics is one of those really big subjects. So hopefully the two different, very complementary speakers will help to emphasise both that localness that's so important in a representative democracy, but also a sense of time that democracies and countries have very long time spans around which all of these things play out. So it's been a fascinating set of conversations, but I'm really interested in getting some feedback from the people that listen to this podcast about what they take away from it too.
Me too. I think they'll be as impressed as I was with both of them because I mean, they're such eloquent speakers as well. So both of them can really down to earth and approachable speakers that can really help you engage with the subject matter. So I think great guests today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Voices of Australia podcast, brought to you by the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute. This podcast is produced by me, Faisal Farah, and with audio, visual, recording and editing by John Bigelow from Interactive Media Solutions. Research for each episode is provided by Agalos Makdijorjos and Matthew Skidmore. Original music is by Steve Klapsinos. Learn more about the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute and all its works by visiting the website www.scanloninstitute.org.au.